October 26, 1955 is a special day in Austrian history. On this day, the last occupying troops withdrew from the national territory, and since then neutrality has been firmly anchored in Austria's foreign policy. Therefore, since 1965, October 26 has also been Austria's national holiday. But how did this declaration of neutrality come about, and how could Austria continue to remain neutral despite joining the EU and the expansion of NATO in neighboring countries? There was already a discussion about a possible neutrality of Austria in the 1920s, after the end of the First World War. Due to its location in the center of Europe, Austria was in danger of being invaded or annexed by another major European power at that time. However, the supporters of this thesis could not prevail at that time, because on the one hand many were in favor of a rapprochement with Italy and Hungary, and on the other hand many Austrians of German origin wanted an annexation to Germany, which later happened. After the end of World War II, Austria, like Germany, was divided into 4 occupation zones, and thus became embroiled in the growing East-West conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union. This was particularly evident in the fact that the future of Austria was debated for a very long time, because both sides feared that if they withdrew, the country would fall under the influence of the enemy. The West feared that Austria would be incorporated into the Eastern Bloc, while the Soviet Union did not want the country to fall into the hands of the US and the West. Especially because the Soviet Union did not agree to the withdrawal of its troops, much time passed, and only after the death of Stalin in 1953 acceleration came to the negotiations. Since the Paris Treaties of 1954 finally decided on the division of Germany and the admission of the FRG to NATO, Moscow insisted on unconditional neutrality in the event of a withdrawal from Austria. Thus, on April 15, 1955, the so-called Moscow Memorandum was signed, obliging Austria to declare itself militarily neutral on its own free will after the withdrawal of the occupying troops. The Austrian State Treaty of 1955 thus forbids Austria to enter into military alliances and to establish foreign military bases on Austrian territory. It must therefore remain strictly neutral militarily. In the following decades, however, this neutrality was repeatedly put to the test. In 1956, shortly after the treaty was signed, the Soviet Union put down a popular uprising in neighboring Hungary, with the newly formed Austrian federal government tasked with securing the borders against armed troops. Fortunately, the Soviet army did not violate Austria's state border at the time, which meant that no order to shoot had to be given. Also in 1968, when the Soviet Union put down the Prague Spring uprisings in Czechoslovakia, Austria faced the dilemma that Soviet troops were operating not far from its national border. However, no borders were violated here either, which is why the order to shoot did not have to be given. Nevertheless, Austria took a clear foreign policy stance here and strongly condemned the Soviet Union's actions. Another problem was the aspiration to join the EU. Until the mid-1980s, accession was considered incompatible with neutrality in Austria. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union did the general understanding of neutrality change, and Austria was able to join the EU on January 1, 1995, without any objections from other countries. In the meantime, therefore, Austria has been neutral for 67 years, which has earned it a reputation as a reliable and impartial mediator for international diplomacy. Thus, not only were meetings between American and Soviet politicians repeatedly held in Vienna during the Cold War, but also today some high-ranking international organizations have their headquarters there. For example, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and also the International Nuclear Energy Organizations. All of these have their headquarters in Vienna. However, some experts at the National Defense Academy in Vienna argue that Austria's neutrality in the classical sense does not really exist nowadays. Especially due to the even closer cooperation between the EU and NATO in security policy, it is becoming increasingly difficult for Austria to adopt a neutral stance. For example, during the Kosovo War in 1999, Austrian airspace was used by the US and the NATO coalition to fly airstrikes against Serbia. Austria had not actually permitted this and therefore protested diplomatically, but Austria did not defend itself militarily or use interceptors. Here the dilemma becomes clear that Austria must contest in its foreign policy. In other words, it has to master the balancing act between neutrality and support for its European and Western partners.